Thank you, Lioba, for the introduction. This is joint work with my co-authors at Columbia, Stephen Campbell, Natascha, and Marcel Nutz. So what I'm going to talk about today is auto-deleveraging. And before I get into it, I should probably explain what that is for those who don't know. This is a problem faced by derivatives exchanges. Basically, any kind of entity that provides leveraged exposure to volatile assets. And so here, our running example is going to be a derivatives, let's say a perpetual derivatives exchange that trades Bitcoin. And imagine you have a user who is long Bitcoin contracts, and the Bitcoin price is going down, right? So they're going to be losing money, and against these losses, they've posted margin. At some point, if the price continues to go down, their account will be under-collateralized, and the account needs to be shut down, because if they continue to lose money, then that's going to translate into an exchange loss. And the ideal case for this is what is called liquidation, where we seize the position in the margin, and the position is sold to participants in the market in order to unwind it. And that's sort of the ideal, but it's not always possible. And in particular, in moments of extreme stress where these liquidations are most likely, there may be no willing buyers of that position, or to the extent that people are willing to buy that long Bitcoin position, maybe they're offering prices which are so low that they would potentially leave the exchange insolvent. So this is where auto-deleveraging kicks in. Auto-deleveraging, the idea here is if we can't find a voluntary buyer of the position at a reasonable price, let's find an involuntary buyer. And so in a futures exchange, every long position is matched with a short position. So at the time that we need to liquidate this long position, what we can do is we can take all the short positions on the exchange that are against that long position, and we can pick some subset of those positions and forcibly close them. In other words, we can force those users, those shorts, to buy the position from the long, and we can do it at a price which keeps the exchange solvent. Right? So that's the core idea of auto-deleveraging. It is simultaneously a position reduction mechanism, because again, you have this under-collateralized position which needs to be removed, and at the same time potentially also lost socialization, because maybe those positions are being forcibly transferred at prices which are not market prices. So the core question that we want to try to answer in this talk is, assuming that you need to do this, how should the exchanges optimally, in whatever sense, do this kind of forced position reduction? In other words, which short accounts should we pick in order to force them to buy back the long position? And in crypto trading, this is not a theoretical event. This is something that does occur, and maybe the most notable instance is October 10th of last year, where there was, over 5 minutes, there was a flash crash in the price of Bitcoin and many other cryptocurrencies, and there were large-scale liquidations and ADL events across many exchanges, including, for example, Binance and Hyperliquid. Here, I'm focusing in on Hyperliquid, which is a decentralized a perpetual exchange, mainly because that's what we use for the empirical data, which I'll get to a little bit later in the talk. But this is something that potentially all exchanges face. One thing I'll observe is that this type of procedure, like ADL, formally doesn't really exist in the TradFi world. It's a little bit something that's more been invented in the crypto trading world, and that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a much more acute problem in the crypto world, in that the assets are much more volatile and people trade with much higher leverage. And so forth. So these risks are higher. And the second reason is that in the crypto world, the way that exchanges have been structured, there's much less credit support. So for example, a TradFi exchange will have multiple layers in a so-called waterfall. First, there's like an executing broker. Then there's maybe various insurance funds. Then there's maybe a central clearing kind of entity. There's all kinds of entities that could potentially potentially absorb some of the losses. But crypto exchanges are typically not designed that way. Typically, you're directly facing the exchange. And moreover, in something like Hyperliquid, if you're trading anonymously, the exchange also has no recourse. Maybe you can lose a bunch of money, and they can't come after you for more. So in principle, this is a problem that any exchange could have. In practice, it's mainly a problem that exchanges trading cryptocurrencies have, be they centralized or decentralized. And for the most part, maybe 95% of perpetuals volume, the ADL mechanism that's used is what's described on this slide. And this is something that was invented by BitMEX in 2017, and I think since then has been roughly sort of copy-pasted by everyone. And the idea is as follows. Remember, our running example is we have a long Bitcoin position, which we need to sort of sell to people. The people we're going to forcibly sell it to are the people who are short, the accounts that are short. So what we're going to do is we're going to rank those short accounts. We're going to rank them according to a priority metric, and the most common kind of priority metric that's used is some combination of P&L and leverage, with the idea that maybe if an account has made a lot of money, if the P&L is high, we should, maybe they're a better candidate for that. And similarly, a leverage we'll see is going to be quite important. But we're going to have some metric like, let's say P&L times leverage, and we're going to sort the accounts according to that order from high to low. And if, for example, let's say we need to auto-delever 1,000 contracts, we will go through this list, 1, 2, 3, 4, auto-delevering those accounts fully until we reach that requisite quantity of 1,000 contracts. So that's kind of the core idea of what BitMEX proposed. But this has a number of issues. First, and most immediate to us, was that it's completely ad hoc. Right? Why do it in a queue? Why do it according to this priority rule? So on and so forth. There may be aspects of it that seem directionally reasonable, but it's not derived from any kind of higher level principle. Moreover, this type of mechanism is manipulable in a lot of ways. For example, it's not Sybil resistant. On an exchange like Hyperliquid, where you can easily sort of spin up a new account, if you take two accounts, like one account, and split it into two, you can manipulate this this type of metric and influence whether or not you are ADL'd. It is also not wash trade resistant, right? When you do a wash trade, you're basically transforming unrealized P&L into margin, and you're going to end up manipulating that P&L component, and also manipulating your likelihood to be auto-delevered. It's also not path independent. If I do 2 ADLs in sequence, that's not the same as doing one kind of ADL on the combined quantity. So it has all these bad properties. So what we did is try to revisit it from first principles. And our kind of first principles approach is that ADL is about mitigating risk. So we should look at this from the perspective of risk. Right? And the exchange should ADL in a manner that reduces its risk going forward. And in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to define ADL mechanisms by defining a particular kind of loss function, which is going to be the total potentially equity shortfall across all accounts at some future date. And we're going to propose ADL metrics that deleverage in a way that minimizes this risk of future loss to the exchange. Right? So that's kind of the high-level principle. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to sort of get into it. And there's going to be sort of 3 steps. One is we're going to describe how this works in the simplest cases where you're trading one asset, which is also called isolated margining. Here we have a very clean and strong analytical solution. We're going to progress from that to the multi-asset case, where you're trading maybe multiple different types of contracts, but supported by one margin account that's called cross margin. There, the problem is more complicated, and we have numerical solutions, but also an analytic approximation. And finally, I'll show you some empirical results of a counterfactual of what would have happened if we applied our methods to the October 10th ADL event on Hyperliquid. So that's what I want to do. I won't spend too much time on a related work, but I'll just briefly mention maybe the other paper that's looked at this problem, which is a paper by Tarun Chintra and co-authors. I just want to mention at a high level, it's kind of pretty different, and perhaps the approaches are complementary. What Tarun seeks to model is he kind of views ADL from the loss socialization perspective, looking at reassigning, looking at allocating this loss across accounts on an exchange. And his results are of the impossibility kind of flavor. We're taking a little bit of a different approach. We're sort of not looking at like kind of loss socialization, but more really kind of focusing on position reduction, which is the actual problem that exchanges have today. And our approach is also more prescriptive. Like we have a particular recommendation for how to do ADL. Okay, so let's talk about the single asset case. So again, idea here is we have a single asset. We're trading Bitcoin futures. There's been a large price movement downward. The Bitcoin price has gone down. And there's some collection of long accounts that are insolvent. Let's call that total exposure Q. Q is the number of contracts. And at time tau, we've decided that we need to ADL. And so we need to force the short accounts to buy back these Q contracts. And so what we're going to do is we're going to index the short accounts by the variable I. Each short account is described by a couple of parameters. One is QI, how many positions, how many units is it short. The second is a PIE, which is the entry price. What price was that short position opened at? And finally, MI is the margin of the short position of the ith account. And using these variables, we can define two things for each account. We can define the equity and the leverage. The equity is kind of like the total value of that account, and it consists of two components. One is it consists of the margin, right? How much USDC was posted to allow this account to trade. And the second is it also, the account has unrealized P&L, right? So as a short position prices have gone down, the account has made money, and so that's part of the value or the equity of the account. And once we have the notion of equity, we can also define the notion of leverage, which is the ratio of the total exposure of the account, right? Like how many contracts short times the price relative to the value or the equity of the account. And so our key idea, again, is going to be to look at ADLing from the perspective of risk. So the idea is here we're sitting at time tau, and this is when we need to make our ADL decision. And our decision is going to be a vector of buybacks xi, which is how much the ith account is forced to buy back. But we're going to make this decision at time tau looking forward to some future time t, which we call the risk horizon. And so at that future time t, the future price piece t might be different than it is today. The exchange may suffer some kind of losses if that price is too high or too low or whatever. So we're going to look at allocating the buybacks right now at time tau, looking forward in order to reduce the risk associated with the exchange loss in the future. And so to get into a little bit more detail about what all of that means, again, the decision we're trying to make is this vector x, which is how much each short account should be forced to buy back. If they buy back xi units, the remaining short position is just going to be whatever they had before qi minus xi. This allocation x needs to satisfy a bunch of feasibility constraints. So the first is that the total number of contracts that are bought back should add up to the amount that we wanted to delever. That's sort of pretty clear. The second is that these XIs are positive. In other words, we are only going to force short accounts to reduce their positions. We're not going to force anyone to increase their positions or to take risk that they weren't taking before. And finally, the last condition is the amount we force an account to buy back can't be bigger than the amount that they were short to begin with, right? So in other words, we can't force someone to be long if initially they wanted to be short. Right, so that's the feasibility constraints associated with the allocation. If we make this allocation x and we adjust the position by the ith account by the quantity xi, I'm going to use this function little ei to denote its equity at some time in the future if the future price is p. Right? And so how much will that account be worth in the future? Well, it's whatever it's worth today, which is that capital EI, plus whatever P&L is associated with the remaining position of the account. And now that account has a short position of QI minus XI. So the second term is just whatever is the P&L from the remaining short position. And this allows us to define our loss. Our loss is going to be the shortfall that the exchange would be responsible for. And what the exchange is going to be responsible for is because futures is zero-sum trading, if any of these accounts in sometime in the future has negative equity, then presumably the exchange is on the hook for that. So our loss function is going to be, again, going out to the future date t when the price is pt, looking at all the equity of every short account and summing up those which are negative. In other words, again, only looking at the account shortfalls. So this is my optimization problem. I'm looking to minimize the expected future loss subject to the constraints that I have. And the key idea here is when you think about the risk associated with a futures position of this nature, leverage is kind of a sufficient statistic. It summarizes everything. And what I mean by that is if I define Li of xi to be the post-ADL leverage of the account, how much leverage the short account had after we sort of delevered it. If I want to understand how much I could lose to this account, what's relevant is how much prices have to move till the account is bankrupt. And that distance to bankruptcy is precisely 1 over the leverage, right? And that's pretty intuitive. If you're levered 1-to-1, if the price moves 100%, you're going to be wiped out. On the other hand, if you lever 10-to-1, it only has to move 10% for you to be wiped out. 100-to-1, 1%, and so on. So if we think about this from the perspective of the optimization problem at the top, if I have a marginal unit of a contract that I need to assign to be bought back by one of the short accounts, well, I'm going to get the greatest risk reduction by forcing a high leverage account to sort of buy it back, because that is the closest to potentially defaulting in the future. So that's the core intuition. And we can wrap that up into a theorem. So my theorem is going to describe the optimal policy in a number of different ways. The first is simply, here's an allocation that minimizes the expected loss. That turns out to be the same as finding the allocation which minimizes the maximum leverage across all accounts after the deleveraging. And that's also the allocation that arises from a water filling or threshold rule on leverage. Let me explain what I mean by that. The idea here is as follows. Suppose we want to deleverage a quantity Q. What we should do is we should sort all the accounts according to their leverage. So here, account 1 is highest leverage, followed by account 2, followed by account 3, and so on. And we start with the highest lever account, and we sort of kind of bring this bar down, forcing account 1 to buy back, reducing its leverage until it ties the leverage of account 2. Once the top 2 accounts are tied in leverage, we're going to drain them both until they hit the third account, and again continue draining in parallel until we have bought back the requisite quantity Q. So this kind of differs to the sort of the standard practice, the BitMEX rule, in 2 ways, right? The similarity is they're both oriented around the priority metric. The difference is that my priority metric is leverage alone. That's the only thing that matters from a risk perspective. That's one difference. And the second difference is the Q-based models proceed through the accounts sequentially. I go through them in parallel, draining all the highest leverage accounts at once. Again, the idea is this is a minimax leverage policy. Let's reduce the, let's minimize the leverage of the maximally levered account in the exchange. And beyond that, this turns out to be point-wise optimal. Now, what I mean by that is when I defined my objective before, it was the expected future loss. It turns out the exact value of the future price doesn't matter. No matter what the future price is, the minimax leverage or water filling policy will have less loss than any other policy. So that means that actually this rule is remarkably robust. I mentioned before that I'm reasoning over the expectation of future prices, but I don't need to know the distribution of future prices. All I need to know is leverage. Moreover, it doesn't matter how you think about risk, whether you care about the average case, the expected value like I have here, or whether you care about the tails of risk like conditional value at risk or whatever. As long as your view of risk is monotone, which is the most reasonable basic thing, this is optimal. Beyond that, it has a lot of other kind of nice properties. For example, it's civil resistant. If I have an account that's split into sub-accounts, the average leverage of those sub-accounts is going to be the leverage of the aggregate account. So you can't avoid ADLing by splitting into accounts. Similarly, it's very obviously path independent. If I ADL an amount Q1 and then ADL another amount Q2, it's the same as doing the sum. It's wash trade resistant and so on. So that's the good case. In the multi-asset case, the difference now is that rather than trading one asset, we're going to trade D assets. So the price vector is a vector of prices of D different contracts. Similarly, the position vectors are vectors of across D different contracts. But every user has one pool of collateral that supports these positions. The challenge here is what made the single asset case easy was there was only one direction where things could go wrong because it's one-dimensional, right? There's only one price. Here, there's no canonical stress direction. There's many directions where prices might move, which may cause issues. And moreover, you can't naively look at leverage because it doesn't account for hedging. Right, you may have an account which maybe is long BTC and short ETH and may be very highly levered, right? But if you reduce the BTC position, you might actually be increasing the risk because those two are correlated. Right, so here it turns out analytic solutions are no longer possible. If we make the assumption that prices are driven by a single factor, so here we have a vector of prices, but a scalar epsilon is a random variable that's pushing that vector in a direction v. In that case, what you can do is you can define an alternative notion of leverage called factor leverage, which is kind of looking at not what the gross leverage of the account is, but what the leverage is in the direction of the dominant market factor. And there you can define a similar leverage draining or water filling notion. However, now on the factor leverage rather than just the gross leverage. I'll just show you quickly some empirical results. This is what happened on the hyperliquid exchange in the crypto market on October 10th. Basically, over a 5-minute interval, you had about a 20% drop in the majors and much bigger drops in thinner names. And on hyperliquid, you have multiple waves of auto-deleveraging, again, over roughly 5 minutes resulting from this. We looked at one of those waves and compared what hyperliquid actually did, which is the top bullet. We compared that to water filling, which is the isolated water filling, which is just pretending that everything is isolated, even though it's not, and doing the one asset algorithm. And then with one factor water filling, and then with risk optimal, which requires numerical optimization. Basically, going from the second row to the third row, you can about double the amount of risk that you can reduce switching to water filling from the existing BitMEX rule. And then beyond that, you can pick up, you can get to almost 90% by switching from generic water filling to sort of the factor model-based water filling. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Hi.
In your counterfactual, do you ever consider how the portfolios held in advance of the stress would be different if we knew we had the different ADL system instead of the BitMEX queuing system?
Yeah, no, I haven't thought about that. I think that's a really interesting upstream question. And there is work, for example, in the finance literature where people look at, okay, if you have a different type of margin system, one versus another, how does that impact trader behavior upstream? I think that's super interesting, but I haven't looked at it.
So I think everything is sort of downstream of the utility function that you defined. I think there's some things that it captures, but there's other things that when I talk to people making perpdex, like they're really worried about the quantity of like individual users liquidated. As soon as you liquidate them even partially, they like massive drop off in retention. And with this approach, you're sort of like hitting more people when you do try to deleverage.
So I agree. So I didn't have time to go through the numerical results in detail. You hit more people, but you hit them less because standard ADL unwinds someone completely, and this does it partially. Yeah, so I think you're right. That may be a consideration. Although I'll say I presented this at a hyperliquid summit with practitioners, and one practitioner came up to me afterwards and said he would love to have a button where he could sign up to be ADL'd, because oftentimes ADLing is extremely profitable. You get basically bought down, you get bought out at the bottom of the market. But you're absolutely right. There may be other aspects to the loss function.
So the existing ADL approach, while flawed, is easy to reason about. I like your approach, but is there a risk that there's implementation complexity or risk is harder to calculate from the trader point of view?
I think if anything, it's easier. I think leverage is super easy to calculate. It's super obvious. Every trader should ideally be aware of their leverage at all times, independent of this. Because it's sort of a core risk measure. I think in a practical perspective, again, it's very similar to what's done. So I think conceptually, to me, it's not that different. Maybe the one thing different may be, I don't know, if you're ADLing thousands of accounts or tens of thousands of accounts at once, maybe there's like gas issues or issues related to that.
I have probably a stupid question, but so in this ADL events, usually, I mean, the long positions are the ones that we're worried about, and now you risk manage the short position. You care about the risk on the short side. Why?
Okay, so good. So this is so Christoph's observation is prices are going down, and the long position is already getting liquidated. Why am I worried about the risk of the short accounts? Well, if you're trading one asset, so first of all, I would argue that the goal here is risk management. So if that's the risk that's remaining, that's what you should worry about. But moreover, in the multi-asset case, it's not obvious what you say, right? The people who are remaining are the risk, and it could be that prices go in some other direction. It's not necessarily that they move the opposite direction that people move money, but there's many directions where the exchange could move money. So that characterization isn't really accurate in the multi-asset case.
Okay. If there are no more questions, let's thank the speaker again and have...
Thank you.